the problem, I think, is that I'm not sure whether the recording will exist. So unfortunately, the recording from earlier, I think, is lost to us forever. But what I will do is I will hope that we can carry on from where we were. I'm just trying to open things and then I'll get the screen back up again. So we were talking, completely lost my thread now, of course, of what we were talking about. We were talking about participants and our relationship with our participants in terms of the research and so on. So hopefully you've all had the opportunity to have a quick cup of tea or something while I've been having a sort of bit of blind panic. It's not great when the whole system goes on you. I have to say that doesn't often happen, and we'll hope that it doesn't happen again. Yes, a gin and tonic would be very nice, but I will refrain from drinking alcohol until I finish my lecture, and then possibly have a large glass of wine when I get home tonight. So there's always that moment, isn't there, when something goes wrong that you think, have I pressed the wrong button, and is it me, or is it something else beyond my control? I think that might have been something beyond my control. So, okay, we'll just wait for the presentation to load. Any questions on any of the issues that we were discussing before the crash? So very much talking about, you know, the different perspectives, and certainly for those of you who are going to go on and do some research, or some of you may have already got experience of doing research, then how your different perspective is, and when you're reading the research that you're collecting in your different topic areas, how different the qualitative research reads and feels, and what different information it gives you about the subjects that you're reviewing. So hopefully you can now see the slides again. So I'm just going to go through where we got to. So we were talking about paradigms. We briefly discussed that. We talked about inductive. This is a recap from a fortnight ago. Asked some questions about what is qualitative research, why would you use qualitative methods, how it applies to you, the differences that we might find between qualitative and quantitative. So certainly when you're reading different researches, research and different research methodologies, you can identify how the different methodologies are presented to you. So how it's different from quantitative research, the core activities we were talking about, researcher beliefs, and we talked a little bit about bracketing and the Hawthorne effect, and interesting discussions about keeping our thoughts as a researcher separate from what we're investigating. Our different relationship with our participants and how they're participants and not subjects, because we're engaging in a subjective relationship with the people that we're researching, or the participants that we're researching. The different selection methods and how we talk about purposive sampling rather than randomized or stratified sampling. The setting for data collection we talked about, and we started to talk about data analysis, and I think this is where we lost connection. Is that about right? I think we got onto this slide when we lost connection. Okay, so we're just about caught up. Okay. So the researcher immerses themselves in the data in order to bring meaning to the narrative. And I don't just mean narrative in terms of an interview, I mean narrative in terms of any data that's collected, and we must just be clear on our terms. So we come to truly understand what the data is telling us, what it's saying about our particular area of inquiry. And it tends to be a cyclical process. While quantitative research might follow quite a linear path, do one thing, then the next, then the next. Qualitative research has much more of a cyclical approach. So we collect data, analyse it, we might reread it, analyse it, synthesise it, report on it, and then maybe change the direction or adapt our sampling or adapt our data collection tool to ensure that we've got a really holistic picture of what we're trying to investigate. And sometimes we call this theoretical sampling, where we collect data because of where the data has taken us. So if you were interviewing a lot of students about a particular issue, so for example, you might be interviewing first-year student nurses about IT services, let's make it topical, and all of them had said the same thing. You're getting a similar family of opinion, and they were saying that their struggles with IT were exactly the same. And then you interviewed one person and they said something completely different, completely off the wall. Now, in quantitative research, you might discount that data and say it's not included in the study for whatever reason. But a qualitative researcher might want to do a couple of further interviews to just investigate whether that was just simply an anomaly, and they do exist, or whether there's actually another thread of information that we need to follow up on. So sometimes the data can lead us in a particular direction. So generalizations drawn from earlier interviews are returned to participants for clarification and elaboration. So we might do an interview with somebody or do an observation, participant observation or non-participant observation, and we might return that information to the participant and say, is this an accurate picture of what you were trying to tell me? Looking for meaning as the data is being gathered, and clustering those different groups together to get some sort of preliminary themes or preliminary categories for further analysis. It does take a lot of time, so we might do an interview, analyse the interview, a transcript, send it back to the participant for checking, seek some clarification in either a follow-up conversation or in a maybe a follow-up questionnaire. So there's other data collection tools that we might use to ensure that we've got a really accurate picture of what they think or feel about a particular issue. Saturation, which I've mentioned before, refers to a situation in data analysis where participant descriptions become repetitive and they confirm the collected data. So it's about confirming what we already think, an indication that data analysis is complete. So if it's not coming up with anything new, we're just repeating what we've found in the past, then that's when we talk about theoretical saturation has been achieved. And this is when data analysis is complete and we can stop collecting any further data. So 3 key qualitative methods that we might use, and we talked about these a little bit a fortnight ago, were ethnography, grounded theory and phenomenology. And you'll come across these different methodologies quite frequently in qualitative research, especially in healthcare. And as it says there, there's a study focus, there's an analytical focus, and is the background discipline that they come from. So ethnography tends to be about culture and cultural fields, cultural groups. It can describe a set of behaviours and its background is very much from the anthropology. We've got grounded theory. Again, we're looking at cultural groups, but we're looking at how theory can be generated by a social process. And grounded theory very much comes from a sociological background. Whereas phenomenology is very much about an individual experience, so not a group experience, but an individual experience, and it's about discerning the essence of the lived experience. So it's very much about what happens for that person at that time. And its background is very much philosophical and psychological. So ethnographic research, as I said, it's associated very much with cultural anthropology. We think about ethnography, we might think about that sort of going native, going out into Eastern Africa, living with a tribe for years and years. There was lots of ethnographic research done in the turn of the 18th to 19th and 19th to 20th century. Charles Darwin, people of that ilk who went out to foreign parts of the empire and collected data on different tribal techniques and different cultural behaviours. And it's very much about actually working with or living with a particular group. Obviously, you're not necessarily going to read any research like that for your topics, but you might come across ethnographic research because it looks at human behaviour. So going back to my student nurse example, how do student nurses, if we were talking about student nurses as a cultural group, how do they behave? What is what are the common themes of the way they react to certain situations? When you put them in a particular setup, what is common in the way that they're thinking and feeling, and what questions are they asking? And we often make sort of tribal statements about people. We talk about professional groups. So certainly in healthcare, we talk about doctors and nurses and paramedics and allied health professionals and geneticists. And we talk about these professional groups as if by being that person makes you behave in a certain way. And one would argue that there are elements of cultural behaviour that happens as a group. So you might think to yourself, all of you work in very different areas, but there might be a culture to that area which makes people behave in a certain way, or react in a certain way, or interpret information in a certain way. So ethnographic research can be really interesting in seeking to understand why a particular group of people behave in a certain way. So grounded theory, on the other hand, is about developing a theory to explain the underlying social processes. So we don't set out with student nurses all behave in a certain way. We, in grounded theory, are much more exploratory, and we will not make statements about how student nurses, for example, behave. We will seek to inquire and allow the observation or the data that's being created, whether it's through, as I said, observation or questionnaire or interview, whatever the data is, that's creating the theory and creating our impression of a particular group. Because the theory emerges from the data, it is said to be grounded in the data. And so it's very much foundations are in symbolic interactionism. The idea that how we are interacting with each other informs the way we behave. Grounded theory has become very popular in healthcare, certainly sort of since the mid-80s. So you will see you will probably come across some theories using, some research using grounded theory as a methodology, dependent on the topic that you choose. So some of you will not come across any grounded theory research, but if you're working in primary care, for example, there's been quite a lot of grounded theory done. Phenomenology is another key methodological approach. It focuses on revealing the meaning of the lived experience from the perspective of the participant. So we are often talking about the narrative. So often in phenomenological research, we might do an interview to really seek to understand somebody's experiences and real meaning and understanding of a particular phenomena from their perspective. So if we wanted to find out about having a diagnosis of breast cancer, we need to ask people who've had a diagnosis of breast cancer for their stories and analyse their stories, their narratives in a very open way. It tends to use quite descriptive language, and it's very much drawn from the discipline of philosophy. So there's often a very philosophical stance to phenomenological research, and there are lots of different types of phenomenological research that you'll come across, but the lived experience is something that you'll see quite prevalently throughout healthcare research, those in-depth narrative accounts of people's experiences of a certain phenomena. Any questions on those three? I'm very much touching on them, so don't think this is everything you need to know about phenomenology or ethnography. It's just a flavour, and hopefully you'll be able to identify some of these themes or some of these methodological approaches when you're reading qualitative research. Any questions? No questions? Okay, so another approach that you will is very much associated with the qualitative paradigm is action research, and it's prevalently used in terms of healthcare research. Action research is a process in which the participants examine their own practice systematically and carefully using techniques around research. So it's very much about practice and practical skills. So we often action research is often used in NHS improvement or improvement in innovation, leadership, change management. All of these different principles, of which I'm sure many of you are engaged in, will use parts of, if not all, of action research in terms of your practice. And you may read some action research in terms of the research that you're evaluating. So it's described as a family of research methodologies because it's not ever one thing. It's not ever one phase. Piece of action research has an action and a research. So there's a bit that we change or do or intervene, and then there's a phase in which we understand what we've done about it. And in practical terms, we often, as I said, use it in terms of NHS improvements. It's an emergent process which takes steps and it's iterative. So we try and understand what we're doing and often improve, change something, and then evaluate it again. There's, as it says there, it's participatory. Change is usually easier to achieve when those affected by the change are involved. So if, for example, we wanted to change practice in a particular environment, we would engage with our staff. So going back to my hand washing example from earlier, if we did some sort of data collection exercise such as an audit, and noticed that in a particular ward their hand washing or their infection control rates were very high. So we identified that hand washing was a particular flaw in their infection control protocols. So we therefore wanted to change or improve hand washing techniques across the ward. What we might do is engage our ward staff in an education programme and a teaching programme, maybe with face-to-face teaching sessions and some posters to engage them in that change of behaviour. And then we might do another phase of data collection where we're evaluating their hand washing, maybe through some observation, and then maybe looking at some more audit data around infection control. So that would be a change management and action research cycle. So as it says there, it's using a cyclical or spiral process which alternate between action and critical reflection and continuously refine methods and data and interpretation in light of the understanding of the earlier cycles. So using my example of hand washing, so you see what's happening, so you observe, reflect on it, see what's the matter with our practice or what needs improvement, for example, plan an action. So in our example of hand washing, we planned a teaching session and a poster campaign, we acted, so we did it, and then we observed again and reflected on it. So it's that constant cyclical process. And I'm sure if we thought for a moment, we could all think of examples of a change management cycle or action research cycle that's been undertaken probably at this very moment in our particular clinical environments. Anybody think of an example? We also often refer to this sort of process as practice development, clinical supervision. We use all sorts of words so the introduction of national early warning scores, new ITU charts, the introduction of a systematic approach to ward rounds, all sorts of different innovations that we are undertaking constantly within the NHS. And that introduction will be part of a piece of action research, or often is part of a piece of action research. So those of you who are on the surgical care practitioner programme or on the advanced critical care practitioner programme are asked to do a piece of practice development as your final part of your masters. And we advocate that you use a piece of action research to undertake that project. Those of you who are going down the pure dissertation route can choose to do a piece of action research as well. And often, and this is just a little aside for those of you who've been emailing me around issues around ethics and progression, if you undertake a piece of action research, it often negates the requirement for a full integrated research assessment system, i.e. IRAS. So something to be thought, something to be cognizant of in terms of your progression through. So action research is another methodological approach, which is clearly visible throughout the NHS. So we've talked about some of the key methodological approaches: ethnography, phenomenology, grounded theory, and action research. That isn't by any stretch of the imagination everything you need to know about qualitative research, but it's very much a touch on the key methodological approaches that you'll see within the studies that you're reviewing. But some of the methodological sections of published articles are quite weak, and you will read them and think to yourself, is this a piece of ethnography? Is this a piece of action research? What are the identifying factors to this piece of research that's been published? And sometimes you need to unpick it yourselves and see what theoretical background that they've come up with. And they all will have a theoretical background, but sometimes you need to use your knowledge and skills in terms of your interpretation of research to really understand what it is that they are using. It would be lovely if every article that you looked at had in the abstract the methodological or theoretical framework for this article was blah, blah, blah. But unfortunately, I don't do that. So some of the data collection methods you'll see in qualitative studies come from either the participant observation, there might be an in-depth interview, it might be a focus group interview. Qualitative researchers often combine more than one method, and that's what I was talking about earlier when I said about shining a different light. So combining your methods to get a really good holistic picture of the research that you're, the topic that you're inquiring around, rather than one single method. So we can combine the methods, but we can't combine the methodologies. So participant observation. Intense, usually long-term examination of a social group or organisation. The researcher becomes a participant in the lives of the group members. So that idea of actually going in there and becoming one of whoever it is that you're researching. So to observe their behaviour and really learn the meaning of systems. Closely linked to ethnography, developed in anthropology, but also done in a variety of disciplines. Obviously, when we're participant observation, that means that we have to be a participant. So if you want to understand advanced nurse practitioner behaviour, you've got to go in there and become an advanced nurse practitioner. A thought might be at that point, but I can't, for whatever reason, I can't become an advanced nurse practitioner. So I might have non-participant observation as well, which is where we can slightly stand aside and observe from a distance. We might talk about if we wanted to do participant observation on student nurses. We can't go back to being a student nurse. There's many classic participant observation studies, and I think possibly the most famous is a study by Erving Goffman, which was back in the 30s and early 40s, which was called Asylum. And if any of you are aware of the film One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, it really, that film very much stemmed from the work of Erving Goffman. He went into a mental health asylum and pretended to be a patient. So he was treated as a patient in an asylum, and the information he collected. We look back on that historically and think to ourselves, there are a number of questions that we have to ask, and there's also a number of issues which would make that kind of study today absolutely impossible. I'm sure we've all come across examples in terms of covert observation. There have been documentaries on the television about people going into nursing homes and observing, secretly filming. That's not a piece of research, that's a piece of investigational journalism. And there is a difference, because if we were researching, we would have to behave in an ethical manner. So a piece of research like Erving Goffman's wouldn't be possible in this day and age, simply because to research in that way, you would have to have ethical clearance. And if you have to have ethical clearance, you have to have informed consent. So the identity of the researcher is known by the people you're studying. You have an overt role. You can't go into a ward and watch nurses' behaviour without their permission. So covert participant is, as it says there, fraught with ethical issues. Now, you can go into a ward environment and say, I am looking to watch your general infection control practices. That would be sufficient, and actually you're looking at their hand washing. but you couldn't go in and pretend to be an agency nurse, for example, and observe their practices, and that would be an unethical practices. So some of the key steps that might be involved in participant observation research is gaining entry to the group. So that's gaining permission to be there, developing and maintaining a rapport, developing a method of taking field notes, and integrating our data collection and data analysis. So some of the key issues there about gaining access to the group is taking into consideration what type of group it is. So we could informally go and join a group, focus group, or get access through some specific person to meet with individuals. But again, we need to be upfront, we need to be honest. Formal organisations will require a formal entry. So if I wanted to speak to a group of practice nurses in a particular primary care setting, I would need permission to go and see those practice nurses. I would need probably permission from the manager of the practice, as well as the participants themselves. If it's an informal group, of course, it's there's a different strategy, and this is where, in terms of research and research ethics, often if you, for example, become a member of an online focus group or online chat room, could you gain access to that group and collect information from that group of people without their knowledge, or without their explicit permission to use their information? That's an interesting question. There's been quite a lot of research done, especially in the last 10 years, about behaviour on social media, for example. Now, you might question whether I have permission to evaluate the information on social media without your explicit permission. And some of you may agree or disagree with that. And there's all sorts of issues around personal freedom, and there's all sorts of discussions at the moment, especially in the US, about targeted manipulation of social media for nefarious gains. But a number of my colleagues, Rona, for example, could talk to you about the use of information on open access blogs quite in depth, because I know she used that for her PhD. So people do use information that's openly and widely available without having full ethical permissions. So access is gained through a particular gatekeeper, and you want to involve the key informants, those who are most knowledgeable about the group. So it says, talking about developing and maintaining a rapport here. So if you are researching a group of people, you need to keep a good relationship with those people in the field, not take sides or associate yourself with one particular faction in a group or an organisation, because you can find yourself falling foul to any kind of internal politics. And if you're trying to observe how a group are behaving, it's not sensible to become aligned with a particular part of the group. Equally, we were talking earlier about the Hawthorne effect and being observed. If you maintain and develop a good rapport with your participants, they will sort of forget that the purpose of your presence is research, and therefore revert to their normal modes of behaviour. Taking field notes is integral, because you need to include descriptions and interpretation of individual interactions and events, and distinguish between descriptions, which will be accounts, and your interpretations of those. And that's where I talked earlier about bracketing. You need to be very careful of what you are understanding by what's happened in a particular group or setup, and ensure that what you've understood to have happened is what the participants understood to have happened. So it might be worth checking and rechecking in terms of an observation, whether it's what you've seen is what you understand that you've seen is what you've actually seen. Record time and location, and other key contextual information. So if you were, for example, observing an interaction in a particular practice nurse setup, and you were observing behaviour in a practice nurse's exchange with a patient, you might want to take note of the time of day and the weather and the general demeanour of both the patient and the participant, the practice nurse, so that you can put some context to what's happened. So, for example, if you were looking at behavioural peaks and troughs in terms of manpower, you might look at how somebody is behaving at the beginning or the end of a day, for example, or if there's a difference in the way they communicate straight after lunch or first thing in the morning and so on. Is there an environmental or contextual factor that influences the success of a particular exchange? You might make some theoretical memos which give you sort of some context and interpretation, so that when you're accessing the data later, you might remember it. So when you're reading research that might have used participant observation, is it clear that that contextual information is obvious to you and you understand it? If any of you do undertake any kind of observational data collection, then you'll know that it's time consuming and very complex. If you're reading research that's used observation and participant observation, are the field notes included? Are the observation schedules included in the presentation of data? Because they can give you real rich information about what's happened or what data collection's happened. So integrating data collection and analysis, organising field notes into different types or files. This is where we start to form a narrative, sort of thematic analysis of what we've found. So categorising the information that we found, having master copies and backgrounds and sub-files and all those organisations. When I look at that slide, I think to myself, that's exactly what you've got to do to the research that you're reading. You've got to start looking for themes across it and sub-themes, and what are the key words or pieces of language or data collection tools or whatever it is that you're seeing across the topic that you've decided to choose. So it's a very similar technique here, using participant observation, that it is going to be for you doing your narrative review. So looking for relationships and common themes across the data. And that's what a researcher would be doing when they're looking at the data that they've collected and how they're analysing it. Another data collection method you might see prevalently used in qualitative is the in-depth interview. So you've observed them and now you do an in-depth interview to allow the participant to describe their experience and the meaning of the events taking place in their lives. That idea that they give you a narrative account. A lot of research that you read will use interview as a method of data collection. And when you're reading that research, you need to ask yourself some questions about the interview itself. Do they tell you that they've got they've transcribed the interview, they've used verbatim quotes to support their analysis? Using verbatim quotes is really important in qualitative research. when you present your findings, because it gives real meaning to what you're saying. It allows the researcher to not only put the analysis in their words, but refer it back to the words of the participant. Interviews can be flexible, and they can allow for sort of follow-up questions and probing. So that in-depth interview tends to be semi-structured or unstructured. And you'll see the use of semi-structured interviews as a common theme across the data that across the research that you're reading. It has an explicit purpose, so there should always be an interview guide, that the researcher and the informants are very aware of what the purpose of the conversation is. So it's not just a chat, it's not just an unscheduled exchange. It has a purpose and it's defined. Ethnographic explanations, the researcher tries to explain from the participant's perspective and make sense of the information that they've collected. So when interviewing for a qualitative purpose, you would hope to use the language that is familiar to the subjects that you are interviewing. So if you were interviewing nurses, you could use medical and nursing language, and that would be normal. But if you're interviewing patients, you should never use professional language. You should use language that's familiar to them. You might see written the combination of the two when you're reading research. So, for example, you might see the medical language in the presentation of data, but there should be some real life language as well, if that makes sense. So you've got context. So the questions might include descriptive questions, structural questions, and contrast questions, and they're pretty much explained there. And the value of the interview method is in a multi-method approach is often to really get a holistic opinion. So we might use an interview and observation, or an interview and a focus group, an interview and a questionnaire, send a questionnaire out and then follow it up with an interview so that we can seek clarity on some of the answers given in the questionnaire. Equally, we might use an interview, some themes might come out of that interview, we might send it to a larger group in terms of a questionnaire. So we can use all these different combinations of methods to get a really, really rich, full and holistic picture of the topic that we're trying to research. So when you're reading a piece of research and when you're evaluating a piece of research, if there's a single method of data collection in a qualitative study, you might ask yourself the question, have they got a really, really full opinion of the topic that they're researching? So that might be one of the questions that you ask yourself when you're evaluating the research that you're reading. Focus group interviews are, again, another method of data collection that we often use in healthcare research, and the research that you're reading may use these, may use this method. It's a sort of interview format, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with a focus group. So you get a group of people together that might have some common experience. It dates back to the 40s and used to access the effectiveness of morale boosting radio shows, for example. In the 1970s and onwards, it was used hugely by market researchers. So those great sort of 1970s commercials about washing powder and fairy liquid and all sorts of things like that. That market research, those 8 out of 10 owners sort of principle. Get a group of people, cat owners, together and see which cat food they like. That's a focus group, commonly used methodology from method from the 70s. And academics really did adopt it in terms of academic research from the 1980s onwards, especially in healthcare. We love to get a group of whatever group of professionals together and ask them what they think about something, or get groups of patients together. That was another. And the rise of wider patient engagement and patient participation groups and all of those principles are based on the method of focus groups. A good focus group should be well moderated and should have somebody asking the questions and then transcribing the recording or taking notes of the discussions that take place. I don't know if any of you have participated in a focus group or whether you've ever done any kind of focus group research. It's really quite difficult. I've assisted as a research assistant in focus group interviews, and it is incredibly complex to capture exactly the essence of the conversation that's going on in the group. Is really quite difficult. The strengths are you can use open-ended questions, you can deal with lots of issues as they arise, it's quite cost effective because you can get a group together at a time, but unfortunately it doesn't get the opinion of an individual equally, and in any focus group setup, you might get a dominant voice, and that dominant voice can very much skew the results. And it's slightly taken out of the natural setting, so you're not necessarily getting true and accurate behaviour. So if you've got a group of, again, student nurses together in a room and ask them about their infection control practices, would you get the actual truth? Would that be the best way of finding out what they actually do in the natural setting? Possibly not, because they'll often, and in research you've always got to be aware of this, they'll tell you what you want to hear. Any questions on those methods of data collection? Have any of you got qualitative research examples as part of your narrative review so far? Have. So have you, there's a couple of examples coming through of people who are looking at qualitative research, and have they used these methods of data collection? Yes, focus groups are often a commonly utilised method of data collection. Questionnaires is something I haven't talked about, only because they are very much what they say on the tin. Questionnaire is a questionnaire, and we're all familiar with questionnaires. The one thing you've got to be aware of when you look at a questionnaire is whether it is a qualitative questionnaire or a quantitative questionnaire. And often questionnaires that you come across have a mixture of both. A perfect example of that is your module evaluation questionnaire. I've given you however many questions there are, and I can't remember, a number of quantitative questions. I want you to grade something, yes, no, very satisfied, satisfied, neutral, unsatisfied, very unsatisfied. So that's a Liggett scale of spectrum of answers from one's very positive to very negative, and often those Liggett scales come in numbers, some of them come in colours, some of them come in satisfied, unsatisfied, that sort of phraseology, so language. So often you will have seen a questionnaire where they said grade it from 1 till 5, 1 being absolutely appalling, 5 being absolutely phenomenal. So you'll have that kind of Liggett scale. And that's a quantitative question, isn't it? It's giving you the ability to measure something and give me a definitive number equated to a particular question. Whereas if you look at the module evaluation questionnaire, at the end, there's some open-ended questions. Tell me what was the best thing about this module. Tell me what was the worst thing about this module. Give me some areas for development for this module. So those have asked you for free text. And when they've asked you for free text and they've given you an open-ended question that doesn't have a one number or one tick box response, then that's got a qualitative aspect to it. So if I was translating that example into research, then I would say that I'm asking a positivist question. And my positivist question is, how good is the module? I've got numerical data which supports whether it's good or bad, and I've got some qualitative data to support the discussion. But the essence of the question, my methodological approach, is still quantitative. So I've used mixed methods, but I've in essence only had one methodology. Quality of life questionnaires are, again, often questionnaires that use a mixed approach, so a quantitative and a qualitative approach to their questions. So they might ask you to grade or numerically score something as well as ask you open-ended questions. So be aware of the fact that one single questionnaire might have different principles, but the overarching question will be either quantitative or qualitative. So you've come across research that's used individual interviews. So going back to my hand washing example, I could use focus groups, then observation, and that would actually be a really good way of confirming or refuting what they said in focus group. I'd sort of think actually a more effective or more, what's the word I'm looking for, more thorough approach might be to do it the other way around. Observe them and then get a focus group together to explain their behaviour. So whereas I could do a focus group first and then observe them, I could equally do an observation and then a focus group. So that might be a different, but that would very much depend on what question I'm trying to ask, and therefore what methodological approach I'm taking to the research. Any other questions? Okay, so in terms of approaches to data analysis, qualitative researchers develop several ways of analysing the data. Two examples might be an ethnographic data analysis or a grounded theory. Both of these reflect the inductive. So remember that language I used right back at the beginning about inductive strategies typical to qualitative data. And each look at coding to identify themes in the data. So ethnographic data analysis looks at the data collection process in the field itself. So while in the field, the researcher might have multiple levels of analysis simultaneously. So you're not just looking at one single thing. You might be looking at context, you might be looking at language and/or language, you might be looking at the situation itself, the environment, etc. So you might be looking at all sorts of different levels of analysis happening at the same time. During the data collection process, grounded theorists analyse as well as collect data. So they use what we call constant comparative methods. And also constant comparative methods are used in action research. So we've used that principle in that methodological approach as well. And the steps of that are that concept formation, concept development, concept modification and integration. So that idea that we'll see what's happening, develop it, modify it and integrate it, and then carry on. So it's a cycle, not a linear approach. So this is really important in terms of your evaluation of research, because when we're talking about quality and evaluating qualitative research, our measures of quality are quite different. We don't talk about internal and external validity and reliability, but we use four tests of quality in terms of the qualitative paradigm. And we talk about credibility, dependability, transferability, and confirmability. And one of the key theorists and key writers in this area are Guber and Lincoln, and their texts on naturalistic inquiry and qualitative research as sort of seminal pieces of work. What do I mean by credibility? So it refers to accuracy. So the description must be plausible and recognised by the participants. So if I collect data, or I'm reading a piece of research, and I'm reading a piece of research about advanced nurse practitioners, for example, and I am an advanced nurse practitioner, and I don't recognise what the participants are saying, is it credible to me as a piece of research? So the more time you spend in the field observing and interacting with the participants, the more credible it will be. But you as a reader of this research must look at it and go, is this realistic? Is this what's happening out there in practice? Or does this not sound at all familiar? A researcher should take the information back, and I've already mentioned this, and say, is this what you meant? So if you were doing observation, you might give them the observation data. If you do an interview, you might give the transcript back to the participant and say, is this what you meant? And that ensures that there's a level of accuracy. I'm sure if you reread what you had said, or not, I'm sure, but at times when you reread what you've said, the meaning either is not clear or it is distilled in a certain way that you need to give it context, or you need to give it clarity. We talk about dependability, and that refers here to the stability and the trackability of the changes of the data over time and conditions. So we want to determine the extent of which another researcher with similar training and rapport with the participants would make the same observation. So often we mention an audit trail. So if I did a piece of research, for example, on student nurses, and I'm an academic of so many years with so much experience, and I did a piece of research on student nurses, would a similar academic in a similar amount of experience find the same information if they did research in the same group of people? So documenting the raw data and assessing the methods of data analysis are important. So looking at the way they've analysed the data in the research that you're reading and seeing, is that clear? Do I know where that information came from? And that's going back to what I said about interviews. That's where it's really important to have, if you're reading a piece of research that's used interview as a method of data collection, they should always include some quotes, because if they haven't got the actual text and the real life verbatim quotes, then is that a a real indication? Are you sure that there is a genuineness to the research that you're reading? Transferability refers to the generalizability of the study. So if I did the finding, if I did the study again in another setting with a similar population in a similar context, would I find the same or similar themes coming out of the data? So lack of transferability is considered to be a weakness in qualitative research. You must always take that slightly in context. So if I did, again, a piece, or if you read a piece of research about student nurses in Devon, and you then read another piece of research that was done on student nurses in London, and you thought, well, actually, this is completely different, and therefore is the transferability of this research weak. You've got to take into account context. So is it fair to compare a piece of research done in rural Devon to a piece of research done in London? And this is where sometimes I ask the question about transferability when people are evaluating research that's been done abroad in different countries. Because is it fair to compare practices from America or Europe with practices here in the UK? And sometimes, yes, it is, because practices are so similar. So is the practice of intensive care that different in Italy than it is in the UK? So intensive care might not, you might be able to say you could look at practices across those two, but is primary care in rural Devon something that you could compare to primary care in Peckham, South London, South East London? So, are the context is so different that the transferability isn't a fair comment. So you need to keep context in mind when you're making an evaluation of quality in terms of transferability. Confirmability is another term that we use which refers to objectivity of the data. I don't mean that in terms of objectivity in terms of a positivist stance. I mean, would another researcher agree about the meaning emerging from the data? So again, going back to the similar statement of the audit trail. So it's not me and my personal biases that are coming up with the conclusions. It is the research itself, it's the data. So going back to that earlier comment before the crash, which might not have been recorded, about bracketing personal thoughts and feelings. So we talk about the audit trail and we talk about confirmability. So some of the advantages and some of the limitations. It focuses on the whole of the human experience and the meaning ascribed to them by the participants. Provides the researcher with deep insights that would not be possible using quantitative methods. Major strength of qualitative work is the validity of the data it produces. So if the data produced by a piece of qualitative research is really strong, then the conclusions that you can draw from it are really sound. Equally, if the methods are flawed, i.e. is my observation schedule flawed, then my data will be flawed. Participants' true reality is likely to be reflected. So if you're doing a piece of qualitative research, then hopefully you're getting the participants' true opinions or true thoughts and feelings. If you're reading it, then hopefully you're getting an insight into a really accurate picture of what the participants think or feel. Obviously, well, not obviously, but the major limitation is the perceived lack of objectivity and generalizability. But I would argue, as a qualitative researcher, that's not what I'm seeking to ask. So I don't mind that it's not objective and it's not generalizable, because that's not what I'm seeking to achieve. But if I seek to achieve that, then using a qualitative methodology and a qualitative method wouldn't be appropriate. The researcher becomes part of the research, and they become a research tool, and that might therefore enhance the lack of objectivity. So that idea of, if you become a participant in terms of your participant observation, and you become a participant when you have an interview with somebody and it becomes more of a conversation, then is that lack of objectivity a flaw in the research methodology? Any questions? Can you all still hear me? Yay. Good. So any questions regarding qualitative research? I've got the Lincoln and Denson Handbook of Qualitative Research is one reference. That pattern book is quite old now, but it's quite useful. And there are a number of different research textbooks, and pretty much every research textbook you come across, whether it's on the reading list or whether it's something that you found independently, will have a chapter or two on qualitative research and qualitative research methodologies, which will give you a bit more of a flavour. A bit more of a flavour of qualitative research. Obviously, depending on your topic, and some of you have selected, but some of you haven't, you will find that there will be a wealth of qualitative research or a wealth of quantitative research. And I'm often asked the question, and I've just been asked it again, is do I have to have a number of qualitative? Do I have to have an X number of quantitative? Do I have to have an equal number of both? Do I have to have 5 qualitative, 5 quantitative, qualitative, 5 quantitative? And the answer to that is it depends on your topic area. If your topic area lends itself to qualitative research, then it wouldn't surprise me if there was no of the opposing paradigms. So you don't necessarily have to get 5 of each or 10 of each. But equally, if you're trying to make some conclusion, about a holistic picture of what's known about a particular subject area, if there is nothing qualitative written, or if there's nothing quantitative written, you might make a commentary on that. Is there a need for it, or do I need to widen my search a little bit to see if there is anything quantitative about this particular subject area, or is there something a bit more qualitative about the subject area? So I would suggest that you look for those different paradigms, but I'm not worried if the majority of your research is quantitative or the majority of the articles that you've used in your research is qualitative, whatever. It's irrelevant. It's about an in-depth analysis of your subject area. So in regards to the literature review and using a critical appraisal framework or a CASP tool or so on, Rona's going to cover that on the next session, because she's going to be talking about appraisal and how you appraise literature and whether it's quantitative or qualitative. A lot of the research texts, including the Muhl and Heck, which is on your reading list, and the Parihu, have critical appraisal, generic critical appraisal tools in the back of their the books in their glossaries, so they have frameworks for you to use to appraise the data, appraise the articles. I don't mind which one you use. There are many out there. There are online CASP tools for qualitative and online CASP tools for quantitative. I don't mind which one you use. Whichever one suits you best is absolutely fine to use. Just be consistent and reference it correctly. So in terms of critical appraisal tools, but as I said, Rona in a fortnight's time is going to be covering that in much more detail on the 24th, because she's going to be talking about critically appraising the literature. I would suggest that you pick one and you use it for all of your literature, but you're not writing a critical appraisal of each individual study. You're writing a narrative review. So although you've got to do a critical appraisal of each article as you read them, that forms the basis of your analysis. It isn't what you write up in your narrative review. And I hope that's clear in the discussion that we had last time about the assignment. And if it isn't, then please do email me, or we can spend some time in a few weeks going over those principles, that you're not writing a Article 1 critical appraisal followed by Article 2 critical appraisal. You're appraising the literature using a critical appraisal tool, and then from that appraisal you're building a narrative. So you're picking out themes and you're discussing each theme as it goes. I said about surgical care practitioners doing a piece of action research for the third assignment. Don't worry about that at the moment. That's what I mean by in your substantive professional project, which is the assignment that you do to complete your master's in the third year. So don't worry about that undertaking a piece of action research, but I would certainly, if you have found a piece of action research around your topic, then it's a really interesting methodological approach. It can be incredibly useful in terms of evaluating practice, and so don't avoid a piece of action research, because action research can be really useful, but don't worry about it in terms of your substantive professional project, because that is 2 years away, and it's not something you're doing now. But you may read a piece of action research in terms of your narrative review. Any other questions? So any questions about qualitative research methodology, or any questions, general module questions about topic or the assignment? Subheadings in the narrative review are often very useful. I'm not going to say I insist, or I'll mark you down if you don't, because some people don't like that as a narrative style, so they don't like to put theme 1 or theme 2 or theme 1 / education, theme 2 / whatever it is, and write about it. Some people like to just have a flow. So I wouldn't mark you down if you didn't. Equally, I won't mark you down if you do. I think in terms of narrative review, headings can be really useful. At signposting the reader, you've got to make the assumption that I'm a bit silly and a bit thick. And actually, if you tell me what you're writing about, if you tell me about what you're writing about, then I have you can meet my or exceed my expectations. If it's just a 3,000 word piece, then I might need a bit more direction. So it's up to you, and so don't worry about it. But yeah, I find that particularly for this assignment, headings can be very useful. Previous examples, yes, I'm just waiting for one last person to give permission. Probably this week I will get the examples up on the tile, and they will go in underneath the crocodile in additional, I haven't changed the spelling there. Additional resources, I will put them in that tile, so they will go under the crocodile, and when I've put them up, I will send you out an email, or I'll send you out an alert saying examples are up. Yes, it's 3,000 words, and it is plus or minus 10%, so 3,333. If it's over that, you'll have marks deducted. If it's under that, you'll have marks deducted. It's not a sliding scale of marks, so 1 word is 1 mark and 10 words is 10 marks. It doesn't work like that, but you will have marks deducted if you go over or under. Any other questions? No, 10% over and 10% under. So if you write 3,333 words, I won't penalise you. But if you write 3,334 words, I will penalise you, but not enormously. So don't worry too much about it. If you write 3,600 words, I will possibly knock a few marks off, but not many. Oh, okay. References aren't usually lost my words. References are not counted in the words, whether they're in brackets or out of brackets. So in text references, real names, whether they're in brackets or not in brackets, don't count your word count. But that shouldn't make too much of a difference, hopefully. Can I just say that I don't, and I probably shouldn't say this, should I really? Maybe I should stop the recording. I don't count your words. So I go Google, word, so if you wrote Smith and Jones et al. 2007 says, what would count in your word count is says. So Smith and Jones or Smith et al. 2007 doesn't count in your word count. Is that clear? Okay. Oh, now you're being really, really picky. Yes, that does mean that if you can write 3,300 words plus in-text references, which might total 3,400 words, and I wouldn't penalise you on word count. Is that clear? If you wrote 3,000, if you wrote 2,700, if you wrote under is more worrying than over. So I'm just reading a question. All assignments are submitted electronically. They're all submitted via the DLE. So if we go back to our thing here, narrative review, I will upload a template, a front sheet template that you can use if you wish. You don't have to, but you can use. On it, there is a thing that says word count, so you actually put your word count in. If you don't use that template, and I don't insist that you do, but I will put one up for you. If you don't use that template, then usually you put a title page in which has your student number, anonymous marking, so please don't put your name on the assignment. So you put your student number and you put the title of the assignment, and you might put the word count. If you don't put the word count on your front sheet or your title page, again, equally, it doesn't matter, it's electronically submitted. So I can literally press a tab on the assignment tile as a marker, and it gives me the word count excluding references. So you don't need to worry about this too much, because as if you're doing it in Word, a Word document will total up all your words, and you look at approximately 150 words for references, approximately. Don't be precise, but approximately. So if you do a select all and word count in your Word document, then it will probably say 3,150, but actually that would be 3,000 words in terms of not including your references. So don't worry too much about your word count. But as I said, I will upload a front sheet template that you can use if you wish. You don't have to, but if you don't use it, then if you could please put a title page. But your title page shouldn't have your name on it, because as I said, it's anonymous marking. So just your student number. And when I upload the examples onto the under the crocodile, I will put the assignment, I'm going to put the assignment template on the module information. So it's there for you. But if you can't find anything, then email me. Equally, when I've put this information up online, which will probably be last part of this week, I will put an announcement on the DLE to say the information is there. And hopefully you all get the announcements through the DLE, because if you're registered for the module, which all of you are, you will automatically get an email to your university email address if I put something on the DLE. Okay, so any other questions? Okay, any other questions? Okay, any questions around topic that you've sent me before now, I will address those and respond to emails this week. If you've got any other questions in the next week or so, then don't hesitate to email me, and I will I'll email you back. As I said, you've got Rona in a fortnight's time, so we won't virtually see each other until the 7th of November, which is our next session together. But obviously I'm available on email between then and now if you need any assistance. Okay, so thanks very much for your attention. I can only apologise for the technical hitch. I have a sneaking suspicion that that earlier piece won't have been recorded, but obviously I will upload the second half as soon as it's available. So thank you for your attention, and goodbye.